years before, but I'm going to just tell you, 2020, don't want to do it again. Ready for it to end. How about you all? You there with me? Would you just physically, just raise your hands and keep them raised? How many of y'all would say 2020, worst year of my life? Just raise your hands and keep them raised. And just look around at how many people would say, worst year ever. And I've heard from so many of you during this year, and I know that there are those among you who have had to take their wedding plans and just strip them down to just nothing. You're like, why didn't I just elope? It would have been easier, right? And then there have been those of you who've had funerals you didn't expect to have. Major life events put on hold. It's just made a mess. Others of you, job losses. Now, it's easy for us to kind of fall into this thing that we're the first people to experience an absolutely brutal year in all of human history. And we can't imagine that anybody else in all of human history has suffered the way that we have suffered this year. But the reality is, that's not true. If you look at the Bible, you go to the Old Testament, you look at the life of the people of the nation of Israel, you learn that they didn't just have a bad year. They had bad decades, strung one on top of the other, after the other, after the other. There were entire generations in the nation of Israel that never had anything but misery. So as the nation of Israel and Judah hit this low point, here comes this incredible military force, and they're just to the north of Israel and Judah. And it's not long before they turn their attention to these two small countries that are an absolute mess. The Assyrians turn their attention toward the nation of Israel. And Israel, in response, reaches out to a neighbor of theirs and says, hey, let's form an alliance. Between the two of us, we can surely stop this army. Nope. As they do the math, they look at the size of their armies, they look at the size of the Assyrian army, they realize they are outmanned and outgunned. So, these two countries, Israel and their neighbor, look south, and they look at the country of Judah, and they say to Judah, why don't you join us in our alliance against the Assyrians? And Judah says, we don't want any part of that. You can have it. So Judah Israel and their neighbor decide they will attack the nation of Judah and force them into their alliance against the Assyrians. So when Judah sees the armies coming, you know what they do? They reach out to the Assyrians, and it's not going to end well at all. So into that picture of despair, God speaks. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, this is what he says. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. You will enlarge the nation of Israel, and its people will rejoice. They will rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, and like warriors dividing plunder. For you will break the yoke of their slavery and lift the heavy burden from their shoulders. You will break the oppressor's rod, just as you did when you destroyed the army of Midian. The boots of the warrior and the uniforms bloodstained by war will all be burned. They will be fuel for the fire. So God sees his people, and he sees how they've been greatly diminished by their sin and by their folly. And he sees how stranded they are in darkness and how there's nothing but gloom and despair as far as they can see. God looks into this terrible picture, and he's not undone. And he says, I'm going to deliver these people, even though there's nothing about them that would make them worthy of it. And he says, I'm going to do a new thing in their broken world. And I'm going to change their lives. He's going to do something that they don't deserve. Then Isaiah promises that one day, God is going to raise up a new kind of king, unlike anything that they've ever seen in their history before. And this king will literally change the trajectory of eternity. It's going to be unbelievable. Isaiah 9, verse 6 says this, for a child is born to us. A son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's armies will make this happen. So Isaiah looks into the future, and he sees this day out there in the future where a Savior is going to be born. And if you look at the text carefully, it says he's going to be born to us and he's going to be given to us. Meaning this Savior, this new King, is going to be 100% human, born to us, and 100% divine. He's going to be given to us. This is the first ever God-man, the only God-man in all of human history. And what is he doing? He's pointing us toward Christmas, isn't he? And he says, on this new king, the government of the world will be on his shoulders. Just think about that for a moment. We have just been through like the nastiest election cycle of all time, right? At least we hope so. Imagine the government built on the shoulders of Jesus Christ. Imagine that. And when Jesus rules, it's going to be like nobody else who's ever ruled before him. His name will be Wonderful Counselor. Just think about that for a moment, that name. Jesus is our Wonderful Counselor. His words are true, they're right. It's like getting incredibly, incredibly good advice. I don't know about you all, but that's been my story throughout my lifetime. I look at the words of Jesus Christ and they change my life. That's my Jesus right there. I thought it would just be good if we took a moment and we reminded ourselves that what we need so desperately to do is to look up, right? Look up. Don't look within. Don't look around, but look up. And the best way that we can begin the habit of looking up is through worship. It's a gift that God has given us. And that's why God invites us to worship him. And he invites us to make worship a habit. Because he knows that we don't need more self-help, and we don't need more technology, and we don't need more Twitter, and we don't need no more Snapchat, and we don't need more TikTok. We need more of him. Because he is where our help comes from.
For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Sing it together. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Oh, the Messiah, oh, to see him high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy. For unto us a child is born, a son is given, a son is given. For unto us a child is born, Son is given. Oh, the Messiah. Oh, to see him high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. That's it, sing it out. Pour out your power and love as we sing holy, holy, holy.
Now here's the thing. When I experience worship, when I allow myself to confront the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, I know peace. I mean, real peace. I enjoy peace with God as I become more confident in His grace and when I experience His presence in my life. And I'm just reminded when I worship God that my hope for the future is placed on His steadfastness and His power. It's all built on the armies of the Lord of hosts. I'm not powerless. God stands with me and for me. And so I just would invite you all, as you think about the next few weeks, and the next piece of discouraging word, that comes along, the next piece of discouraging news that you hear, instead of raging against it, instead of throwing up your hands in despair, just say, you know what, at that moment, I'm going to stop and I'm going to worship. And I'm going to look to God because that's where my help comes from. That's where my hope is. And I'm going to place my confidence in Him.